Welcome to Windows on the World. Tonight, truth and lies, fact and fiction, the assassins of truth. The show's actually called Cabal, Delusions, a force they fear. All will be explained. Tonight, a look at the age of reason and enlightenment. Thomas Paine and the delusions of Cabal Freemasons, plus the power that they missed that is available to all. That's including you, of course, and me. First, let's quote from Thessalonians 2. This is the New International Version. The man of lawlessness. The coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. He will use all sorts of displays of power through signs and wonders that serve the lie, and all the ways that the wicked deceives those who are perishing. They perish because they refuse to love the truth and to be saved. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion, so that they will believe the lie, and so that all will be condemned who have not believed the truth, but have delighted in wickedness. The most audacious lies at the moment are the most successful, but of course, lies are always exposed. And I think that first quote should be very encouraging to anybody who has actually got the truth. It is believed by Cabal cult members that the sons of Abel and Seth are willingly doing the bidding of the brotherhood of Cain, their brotherhood. The beliefs of the Freemasonic cult are that Cain, whose mother Eve was impregnated by the Lucifer spirit, who left Eve before the birth of Cain, making Cain the son of a widow and partly supernatural, the son of Lucifer. This is what they believe. This is the core of what Freemasonry is actually all about, which is why they are called the sons of Cain. And Samael, the blind god in earthly incarnation, is who they are actually in league with, or want to be in league with. So, the sons of Seth and Abel are the people who are doing the dirty work, knowingly or unknowingly, of the brotherhood of Cain. And as we've stated in shows such as the Rosicrucian Mystery, the pyramid of power puts the brotherhood at the top. Their agents of Abel and their minions of Seth carry out the work of their masters as their priestcraft. So let's recap on this system. The Lucifer spirit Samael united with Eve and begat a semi-divine son, Cain. As he left Eve before the birth of the child, Cain was the son of a widow and a serpent of wisdom. The sons of Cain, ruled by fire, or as they like to call themselves, the Illumined Brotherhood, or Luciferians, work with the sons of Seth, water, their priestcraft, to control the sons of Abel, whom they believe through their manifesto and biblical interpretations are docile, compliant, and follow the self-appointed leadership of the Brotherhood of Cain. The story of Lazarus raised from the dead holding the rose, which was to become the symbol of the RC, is important as he was also son of a widow, as allegedly was Cain. According to the RC, that's the Rose Cross, the Rosicrucians, the Order of the Rose Cross, the rose is a symbol of the alchemical blending of the fire of Cain and the water of Abel. In reality, the banking system is the fire and the system administration is the water. This is the Rosicrucian alchemical blending of fire and water. This was actually heard in court at a protest a few years ago with the globalist-backed group Extinction Rebellion, which is a City of London project. They were on trial for criminal damage and obstruction, and the judge told them they needed to be more like water because they are the administration. They need to follow the instructions of the Brotherhood of Cain because they are flowing like water, whereas the banks are the fire. The financial input and control is run by the Brotherhood of Cain. This is just a management concept, nothing more, nothing esoteric about it. It's really simple, childishly simple, actually, when you think about it. It's a template for business and it's a simple control mechanism. The priesthood carry out the work of the governors. If we take a pyramid, for instance, and split it into three sections, the three-step pyramid of power, the so-called elite at the top This is a financial elite, not elite thinkers. Very important distinction there. They send their offspring to the top universities, which prepare them for the roles of top-end administration, which can, of course, mean running a country, running a council, or being in some big corporate job. Of course, corporations are just as powerful as governments. They are led to believe they are the elite, but in reality, they are all just useful idiots and all expendable. And often, when they do reach what they think is the top, they fall out. This is the result of what we've been talking about in a few of our recent shows. And if you go back to the show about the pharaohs, you'll find out why that is. Because they copied this Egyptian system, which was basically just around this idea of ritual. And we covered that in that particular show. But when we look at the pyramid, this is why the capstone is detached. They believe nothing can touch them. Well, in the second part of the pyramid, we have the day-to-day administrators. They just repeat what they are told and believe in themselves. They think a lot of themselves. They suffer from high esteem as they are well paid for being, in reality, less than mediocre. There's the trick. Mediocrity is what is promoted. Nothing exceptional is promoted because that's the system we are in. Anything exceptional would stand out, therefore that's no good. The cult of the mediocre is very important. It promotes those who are easily controlled. They are usually egotistical narcissists. When in the front lines, your local council, you'll see them in high position jobs. It's staffed by these sort of people. They're given big titles like cabinet member for the environment, head of sustainability, and all the divide and rule jobs to do with diversity. So that second part of the pyramid is a massive administrative system, which includes all the MPs, the government, people who work in local government, and people at the top of corporations. Not, of course, the real major corporations, but the corporations which are used as the administration arm for global governance, Agenda 2030. So the lower part of the pyramid now, well, they're seen as serfs, expendable, and not even useful idiots. But this, of course, is a fatal mistake. Those who are self-educated and can actually make things and be creative are the direct opposite and antidote to those who at present call themselves elite. Billionaire financiers and heads of corporations are not elite. They just have money. One thing that is clear, those who took up the idea of being elite in the recent past are dupes. We've covered the likes of Thomas Paine and the age of reason, the age of so-called enlightenment. And we're going to be getting into that tonight as a great example of how these so-called elite thinkers are not elite at all and, in effect, not really very good thinkers. Thomas Paine saw the church as a restrictive institution which was outdated and assumed that this was what the ideals of Christianity were all about. Of course, this was a huge mistake. The church had nothing to do with the early Christianity. The church was just a steering mechanism. So what Paine did here is he put Christianity together with the church, and then he made a lot of assumptions. He was right about the church in one way, and now it is an empty shell and merely a driver of this communitarian system. And we've seen a lot of that in the press recently, especially in the UK with the resignation of Justin Welby, who was actually from the world of finance and oil, which says it all really, doesn't it? But talking about the church as a spiritual force is completely missing the point. So Paine then talked of the Druids, whom he knew nothing about. This was because their history was written by the Romans. In our show and article on the homepage at Windows on the World, just put the order of knowledge into the taskbar and it will come up. There are some links to information that was passed down and some history about the kings of Ireland, such as Luga MacLuga, who had real knowledge of how the ancient governing systems of Druids, which these early kings knew of, actually operated. It appears this knowledge was handed down, but the Romans changed the history and rewrote it in their favour. And this is really all that Thomas Paine is repeating, Roman history. There was a huge gap in the perceived history written by the Romans and incorporated into Freemasonry, which the likes of Thomas Paine repeat, and the reality, which most of them are oblivious to. But the real purpose of Freemasonry was to destroy Christianity. And if you go to the Force They Fear at windowsontheworld.net, you'll see some shows on that. Look at the Brotherhood of Evil, where we go through the book The Dissipation of the Darkness by G.S. Lawrence, and that will put things into further perspective. So, this alone is a major flaw in the so-called Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. Here is what Thomas Paine said about religion and Freemasonry. From these reports and declarations of Masons of the highest order in the institution, we see that Masonry, without publicly declaring so, lays claim to some divine communication from the Creator in a manner different from and unconnected with the book which the Christians call the Bible. What a fatal mistake he's made here. A useful idiot, an absolute dupe for the people who were behind Freemasonry. He says, and the natural result from this is that Masonry is derived from some very ancient religion, wholly independent of and unconnected with that book. Well, he's right there, because it's not connected at all to Christianity or the New Testament or even the Old Testament. What it's actually connected to is the Kabbalah of the Languedoc, and we'll get into that as we go along. But what he's actually saying here is what Freemasons use to get people away from Christianity. And what they've done, of course, is incorporated it into the Gaia religion and anything which will go against the precepts of the early Christians. So this is not true at all what he's saying. The religion of Freemasonry was Kabbalistic by the time Thomas Paine was around. In the oldest Freemasonic document, for instance, this is an English document known as the Regius Manuscript, dated 1390. It refers to Freemasonry being in England in the time of good King Athelstan. Athelstan was king of the Anglo-Saxons from 924 to 927, and he died at Gloucester on the 27th of October 939, and he's buried at Malmesbury Abbey. So, the Freemasonic doctrine followed by the social engineers up to the early 20th century was based not on anything earlier than the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, which by the 1700s had become a Kabbalistic order using the doctrine and symbols of the Kabbalists of the Languedoc mixed with some astrotheology, which we can see in the writing of Thomas Paine. So Thomas Paine was completely off when he was talking about Freemasonry, and he knew nothing about Druids. All he knew was what he'd been told. He was, in effect, a useful idiot. So let's get back to some more quotes from what he says about Freemasonry. Masonry, as I shall show from the customs, ceremonies, hieroglyphs and chronology of Masonry, is derived and is the remains of the religion of the ancient Druids, who, like the Magi of Persia and the priests of Heliopolis in Egypt, were priests of the sun. He's really drunk the Kool-Aid and fallen for it here, hasn't he? What a dupe. It gets worse. They paid worship to this great luminary as the great visible agent and great invisible first cause, whom they styled without limits. In Masonry, many of the ceremonies of the Druids are preserved in their original state, at least without any parody. He's got no idea. I mean, Freemasonry is a parody. It's a bunch of rituals which merely mentor the initiate into obedience. They learn nothing. And it doesn't matter whether it's the 3rd degree or the 33rd degree. They won't have learned anything. So it carries on. His image in the form of the sun is the great emblematical ornament of Masonic lodges and Masonic dresses. It is the central figure on their aprons, and they wear it. Also pendant on the breast in their lodges and in their processions. At what period of antiquity or in what nation this religion was first established is lost in the labyrinth of unrecorded times. Well, he's got no knowledge of the history of what he's even talking about here, because we've already established that Freemasonry was in Britain 939 AD at the latest. So when he talks about this, he's talking about what he's been told. He has not sourced anything, and he has not done any real research. So this is quite a revelation, I think, in that when we are talking about the social engineers that have shaped what is going on now, we have to remember they were clueless. So the Age of Enlightenment was influenced by an infiltration and nothing to do with Druids at all. Mixed with the sun worship they identified with Egypt and paganism, they missed the power inherent in the way, the early Christianity. And the whole purpose of Freemasonry is to destroy Christianity. And yes, if you go and look at the force they fear on the homepage at Winners on the World, that should be quite a revelation. It's a shame that Thomas Paine didn't know about this before he jumped headfirst into making a complete fool of himself. So the true religion of the early Christians is the enemy of Freemasonry. It is now the enemy of the communitarian system which we live in the present time, which has surpassed the need for infiltration. As of course, everyone becomes an agent of the system or is deemed to be one of the words used to describe that which is against the system: hate, intolerance, bigoted, and a few more. So we have a system that's imposed from above that masquerades as the community. Therefore, the infiltration is done by the public themselves. There is no real need for Freemasonry anymore. It's kind of fulfilled its use. But let's get back to this, because nothing to do with Druids has anything to do with Freemasonry. And nothing to do with Freemasonry has anything like advanced thinking. It was set up to destroy the way. So, yeah, just take a look at the Brotherhood of Evil. I know I keep mentioning these, but they kind of join together with what this information is all about. And it is indeed a big revelation. It's well worth looking into. And because these shows have been put out, they're very concise. So you don't have to go and look for hours and days and weeks and go around endless rabbit holes, because I did all that years ago, and I jumped out of the rabbit hole and saw how the simplicity of systems actually work. And that's what these shows are really all about. So yes, see that show, The Brotherhood of Evil, and the force they fear, and it contains the work, The Dissipation of the Darkness. So the story of how King Herod Agrippa set up the temples which became lodges in 43 AD to counter what his plotters described as the mysterious force is what this was all about. Thomas Paine carries on with his misinformation thus. Let's get into it. He says it is generally ascribed to the ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians and the Chaldeans, and reduced afterwards to a system regulated by the apparent progress of the sun through the 12 signs of the zodiac by Zoroaster, the lawgiver of Persia, from whence Pythagoras brought it into Greece. Well, basically what he's done here is just repeated what is read or been told. He says the worship of the sun as the great visible agent of a great invisible first cause. The emblematical meaning of the sun is well known to the enlightened and inquisitive Freemason, and as the real sun is situated in the centre of the universe, so the emblematical sun is the centre of real masonry. Well, one could ask, well, what about the Brotherhood of Saturn, which is closer to the dark heart of Freemasonry than the sun? And what about the morning star which they worship, which is Lucifer, which is in the centre of the grand... Welcome back to Windows on the World. Yeah, just before the break, I accidentally unplugged the internet lead with my foot, which is why I took that break at that point. So if it went quiet for a few seconds, that's why. Otherwise, it should have stayed on air. But yeah, I'd like to thank everyone who sends in information to the show and those who support the show. You can join the £5 a month club and it helps to keep things going. I will be moving on to a different platform in the new year, and that will probably be Podbean. I've also started uploading some of our shows to YouTube. The reason I'm doing this is because we stopped uploading there for such a long time, and we put them on Odyssey, which is another platform. All the links are on the homepage at Windows on the World. And I started to use YouTube again, and I like it for the comments and to stay in touch with people, and it does bring a few more in, which is good because the information needs to get out. So I'm putting selected shows up there. And of course, the full archive of all the Sunday shows is on the live shows page at windowsontheworld.net. Go in there, have a look around and put them on in the background because the information there is very concise, and that's the point of it. I want to save you some trouble, and also it's a way of me putting the information where I can find it. It's like an encyclopedia, which is what the whole website is all about. So let's get back to the delusions of Thomas Paine and Freemasonry. Let's just carry on with what we were saying about this before the break. So the limited belief system of Egypt and Zoroaster is what we were talking about. They are included in what he's talking about in reference to Freemasonry. But the real force they fear is excluded. Thomas Paine merely repeats what is being told. So let's carry on with what he had to say, because it's actually, in a way, it's quite comedic and it's a bit sad, and it's also quite disturbing. He says, "We all know," continues he, "that the sun is the fountain of light, the source of the seasons, the cause of the vicissitudes of day and night, the parent of vegetation, the friend of man. Hence the scientific Freemason only knows the reason why the sun is placed in the centre of this beautiful hall." Oh, they love a bit of word salad, don't they? I mean, the thing is here, it's quite amusing because if we go into the later Rosicrucians, we're talking about early Freemasonry, but we go into the Rosicrucians of the 1600s. We can see from the Forma Fraternitatis and the Confessio and the Alchemical Wedding, which was written by Johannes Valentin, that they love allegory and word salad. They really love anything which doesn't get to the point, and they love to use the word mystery because it means they don't have to explain anything. So what Paine doesn't mention is the light in the centre of the ceiling in London's Grand Lodge, which was completed in 1717. And he doesn't mention that the light that they worship is Lucifer, the morning star, and not the sun. So they may have the rising sun on their aprons as a symbol, but they worship the morning star. That is clear when we look at the centre of the Grand Hall at Freemasons Lodge in Great Queen Street in London. You can walk in there and have a look. You can go and get a guided tour and have a look around in the places that they'll show you. But when this Freemason was being interviewed in the Grand Hall, they said, "Oh, it's one of the major stars." I thought that was really funny the way they said that. In other words, they didn't want to say which star it was. So the likes of Thomas Paine have been completely, to use a Freemasonic term, hoodwinked. So let's see what else he says. "The Masons, in order to protect themselves from the persecution of the Christian Church, have always spoken in a, wait for it, here it comes, mystical manner of the figure of the sun in their lodges, or, like the astronomer Lalande, who is a Mason, been silent upon the subject." Well, the real reason for this is that Masonry leads nowhere except into a control system designed around oaths which bind the mind, body and soul of the initiate and lead them into a spiritual void. The real trick is there is no knowledge given, just degrees and the need to pay more money to the lodge and get deeper into obligations. And if you find someone who has been in Freemasonry, they will probably tell you exactly the same thing, because this is something I've looked at for many, many years. And there is so much rubbish talked around the subject. When we talk about the Martinists and the Ellis Cohen, none of these other researchers into Freemasonry go there. Why? Because these are the lodges of importance. And these are the lodges out of the public view. But, like the Illuminati lodges in France, they were very prevalent and they were public. They were not private. So, he says the lodges of the Masons, if built for the purpose, are constructed in a manner to correspond with the apparent motion of the sun. He can't get out of this, can he? They are situated east and west. The master's place is always in the east. In the examination of an entered apprentice, the master, among many other questions, asks him, "How is the lodge situated?" The answer to this is east and west. The question is, why so? The answer is because all churches and chapels are so, or ought to be so. This answer, which is mere catechismal form, or catechismical form, which is what he's wrote, is not an answer to the question. Oh, never. He says it does no more than remove the question a further point, which is why ought all churches and chapels to be so? But as the entered apprentice is not initiated into the druidical mysteries of Masonry, he is not asked any questions to which a direct answer would lead thereto. So once again, he's completely off the beaten track. The apprentice is entered into nothing. The cover story about the situation of the church is a complete distraction. There was a lot more to the Druids than knowing where the sun rose and set, and they call this an ancient mystery? What a joke. This is the diversion into banality. For the initiates, the idiots who are the pawns of those who believe they are elite in the capstone removed top part of the pyramid, which is where the Egyptian bit comes in. The purpose of Freemasonry was to destroy Christianity, the force they have feared for 2,000 years. All the other pageantry and ritual is just that. Apart from being reborn into the brotherhood, for life after the third degree as Master Mason, there is no purpose except to bind with a blood oath. The blindfolding and being pushed around to warn what might happen if the lodge secrets are given away in the third degree couldn't make things any clearer. Your throat will be cut or your heart cut out. Check out Morgan's Freemasonry, an exposition of the degrees of Freemasonry, which was published in 1826. I've actually got a copy here. Captain Morgan was murdered for informing the world by publishing the rituals and degrees of Freemasonry in 1826. Well, a more recent example of the power of Masonic Kabbalist finance was the murder of Roberto Calvi, known as God's banker. Calvi was born on the 13th of April 1920 and died the 17th of June 1982. He was an Italian banker dubbed God's banker, and from the Bank de Dio. And he was dubbed God's banker by the press because of his close business dealings with the Holy See. He was a native of Milan and was chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, which collapsed in one of Italy's biggest political scandals. Calvi's death by hanging in London in June 1982 is a source of enduring controversy, says Wikipedia, and was ruled a murder after 2 coroner's inquests and an independent investigation. 5 people were acquitted in Rome in June 2007 of conspiracy to murder Roberto Calvi. Popular suspicion has linked his death to allegedly corrupt officials of the Vatican Bank, the Sicilian Mafia, and the Continental Freemasonry Lodge Propaganda Do. Calvi went missing from his Rome apartment on the 10th of June 1982, having fled the country on a false passport under the name Gian Roberto Calvini. Fleeing initially to Venice, from there he apparently hired a private plane to London via Zurich. A postal clerk was crossing London's Blackfriars Bridge at 7:30 a.m. on Friday 18th of June and noticed Calvi's body hanging from the scaffolding underneath. Calvi had 5 bricks in his pockets and had in his possession about $14,000 in 3 different currencies. Calvi was a member of Licio Gelli's illegal Masonic Lodge, Propaganda Do, P2 it was called, that's what the public know it as, who referred to themselves as Fraternity of Blackfriars. The Blackfriars, they were known as. And this led to a suggestion in some quarters that Calvi was murdered as a Masonic warning because of the symbolism associated with the word Blackfriars. Well, it's not really symbolism, is it? He was actually hung off Blackfriars Bridge. Couldn't be more obvious, actually. The day before his body was found, Calvi was stripped of his post at Banco Ambrosiano by the Bank of Italy, and his private secretary, Graziella Coroscia, jumped to her death from a fifth-floor window at the bank's headquarters. Oh, she was suicided, maybe. Coroscia left behind an angry note condemning the damage that Calvi had done to the bank and its employees. Her death was ruled as a suicide. So that just gives you a little bit of insight into what Freemasonic ritual is all about. So now let's get back to Thomas Paine and his delusions. Paine talks of the ritual of entered apprentice and then more on the questions asked in the ritual which mean nothing and are just distraction. He then states, this, among numerous other instances, shows that the Christian religion and Masonry have one and the same common origin, the ancient worship of the sun. He just won't stop talking about this. It's really funny. It goes on all the way through. The distraction of astrotheology, of course, was pushed by the Theosophists and the New Agers, all this under the thumb of controllers as a distraction. Well, do you remember that controlled opposition film, Zeitgeist? The examples it gave of connected sun religions were provably false. So one could say it was a Freemasonic propaganda film, the sort of propaganda that Thomas Paine lapped up previously. And we've got to remember Thomas Paine was involved in some high-level stuff, including, of course, the American Constitution. But these projects give those who know a little about global governance a few true tidbits, which are common knowledge, along, of course, with the distractions necessary to keep them in line. So that film, Zeitgeist, was pushed around the so-called truth community. And I got sick of hearing about it. And all that stuff that they were saying at the beginning about astrotheology and how religions were all connected, and that the Jesus story, the story of Buddha, and all these other religions were somehow from the same source, the sun, is complete nonsense. And it was debunked by someone called Chris White, Zeitgeist Challenge, I think it was called. He had a website up asking for any proof that what Zeitgeist said about these religions was actually true, because it wasn't. It was actually from another conspiracy theorist, I think called Akaria S., who tried to debunk Christianity. So it was what you could say a Freemasonic distraction. Getting back to now to Thomas Paine and his influential delusions. The High Festival of the Masons is on the day they call St. John's Day, but every enlightened Mason must know that holding their festival on this day has no reference to the person called St. John, and that it is only to disguise the true cause of holding it on this day that they call the day by that name. Well, here again, he is completely off, as St. John's Day, the 24th of June, was not celebrated during the time of early Christians, and it is, in fact, a Roman festival celebrated after 400 AD, nothing to do with the way at the time of Christ. He says, as there were Masons, or at least Druids, he can't leave this alone, can he? Many centuries before the time of St. John. John, if such a person ever existed, the holding of their festival on this day must refer to some cause totally unconnected with John. He's so gullible, isn't he? I mean, reading it now, it's ludicrous. Well, at least he's right about that bit, but the rest goes back into his fantasies about Druids, which he, of course, knew nothing about. He says the case is that the day called St. John's Day is the 24th of June and is what is called Midsummer Day, and it is in honour of the sun, which has then arrived at his greatest height in our hemisphere, and not anything with respect to St. John that this annual festival of the Masons, taken from the Druids, is celebrated on Midsummer Day. He's completely missed the point, hasn't he? He's completely and utterly missed the point that it had nothing to do with Christianity at all. Nothing. So a Roman festival left over from Mithra and not invented until after 400 AD and nothing to do with Christianity, let alone Druids, is what he's talking about. Thomas Paine makes the common mistake of mixing up the rites and rituals of the Roman Church with Christianity when there is in fact no connection whatsoever. Constantine relocated the site of Christianity and it was incorporated into the Roman cult, not the other way round. So those following this distraction, this ritual, fell for the anti-Christian Luciferian aims of the godless, the man of lawlessness, the humanist, the material atheist. They became the agents of the brotherhood of Cain. Let's see what else he says. Customs will often outlive the remembrance of their origin. And this, well, he's got that bit right. And this is the case with respect to a custom still practised in Ireland, where the Druids flourished at the time they flourished in Britain. On the eve of St. John's Day, that is, on the eve of Midsummer Day, the Irish light fires on top of the hills. Well, Paine can't really stop debunking his own argument here, can he? He says this can have no reference to St. John, but it has emblematical reference to the sun, which on that day is at its highest summer elevation and might be in common language be said to have arrived at the top of the hill. Wow! He's really putting it together now, isn't he? As to what Masons and books of Masonry tell us of Solomon's temple at Jerusalem, it is no ways improbable that some Masonic ceremonies may have been derived from the building of that temple, for the worship of the sun was in practice many centuries before the temple existed, or before the Israelites came out of Egypt. And we learn from the history of the Jewish kings, 2 Kings, chapter 22 and 23, that the worship of the sun was performed by the Jews in that temple. It is, however, much to be doubted if it was done with the same scientific purity and religious morality with which it was performed by the Druids, who by all accounts that historically remain of them were a wise, learned and moral class of men. Well, unfortunately, all that remains of the Druids is what the Romans wrote about them. So, in other words, Paine has been sold a complete pup. And if you go to an article we put out called The Order of Knowledge, have a look at that, and there is some insight into what was around at the time, what these ancient monuments and dolmens were really for, and what the kings of Ireland knew about Druidism. Of course, the Romans knew where they were, but they divided and ruled the Druids. What they did is they turned them against each other. And they also said that the Druids would cut out the entrails of their enemies to divine the future. Now, we don't know whether any of this is true. And when we look at Roman history, we just have to take it all with a pinch of salt, because they wrote the British history. And anything after 600 AD was really not to be trusted, because this was after the time of the Roman Church bringing Christianity to Britain in 597 AD and converting King Ethelbert. And we've gone into that in some previous shows. But it's very important to know this stuff, that there was an advanced civilization in the British Isles and Ireland way before this and way before the Romans turned up. And the Romans actually used roads which were already there, and we call them Roman roads. So they took credit for a lot of things they didn't even do. Let's get back to this. Paine carries on and completely missing the point, and showing he has fallen for the cover story given to him. Even though he was duped, Paine was a very important, useful idiot to the Cabalists. And so it was that the aristocracy of England had fallen for the cover story of Freemasonry. The real goals remained hidden whilst they busied themselves working against their own interests, until today, when the need for the lodge as infiltration and control has been surpassed by the idea of global community, where everyone becomes an administrator through an imposition from above masquerading as the community. The word community is them not you. Everything has been done to destroy the real power, but it cannot be done. Therefore, it is undermined and attacked in every way possible. That is, of course, the original way, the true Christianity. However, the force they fear is still on earth. In 2,000 years, it has not been conquered, and that is the real secret. When the materialistic and humanistic approach was taken, they had doomed themselves. A massive failure in how natural law systems operate. So what we can glean from all this is that a so-called elite education system and system of management is in effect a load of repeated garbage. I do like to be a bit iconoclastic here because I think it helps people to separate the fact from the fiction and the truth from the lies, because everyone internally should know what the real truth is. Once one knows internally what the real truth is, they have the force that these people feared, and the reason that Freemasonry was set up was to destroy that force, which is still on earth and still available to everyone. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Do stay in touch through the website, support the show if you can, join the £5 a month club, it helps me to keep things going. info@windowsontheworld.net if you want to do that, and you can support us on the homepage too. And thanks to everybody who supports the show. Until the next one, that's it from Windows on the World.
Into your trust.